Spanish Colonies in the New World, Part 1, The Conquest Begins. When Christopher Columbus set sail in 1492, he wasn't looking for a new world, he was searching for a shortcut to Asia. But what he found instead would forever reshape the planet. His voyages opened the floodgates for a wave of conquest, colonization, and cultural collision unlike anything the world had ever seen. For Spain, this new world promised unimaginable wealth. Gold, silver, new lands, new souls for conversion, and above all, power. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, saw in Columbus's discovery the hand of divine providence. They believed God himself had chosen Spain to spread Christianity across the earth. And so began one of history's most dramatic, and devastating, chapters, the birth of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. In 1493, Columbus returned to the Caribbean with 17 ships and over 1,000 men. The second voyage wasn't about exploration anymore, it was about colonization. Settlements were built. Indigenous communities were enslaved. Conflict spread. Disease, brought unknowingly by the Europeans, began wiping out entire islands. Within decades, entire cultures, like the Taino of Hispaniola, had nearly vanished. But Spain's ambitions were just getting started. From the Caribbean base, Spanish conquistadors, conquerors, launched expeditions deeper into the mainland. Men like Hernán Cortés, Francisco Pizarro, and Hernando de Soto became legends, both admired and feared. They were driven by a single dream, El Dorado, the mythical city of gold. In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico with just over 600 men, a few horses, and an iron will. Ahead of him lay the Aztec Empire, one of the most powerful civilizations in the Americas. Its capital, Tenochtitlan, shimmered on the waters of Lake Texcoco like a vision from another world, wide boulevards, canals filled with canoes, and towering temples that reached toward the heavens. Cortés should have been crushed. The Aztecs numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Yet through a mix of cunning diplomacy, deception, and devastating violence, he turned native rivals of the Aztecs into allies. With their help, and with the deadly power of European diseases, the Spanish siege ended in blood and fire. In 1521, Tenochtitlan fell. The empire of the Aztecs was gone. The conquest of Mexico became the template for Spain's empire building. A combination of sword, cross, and crown. Missionaries followed soldiers. Churches rose on the ruins of temples. Spanish law, language, and religion spread across the land, but so too did resistance, grief, and loss. Soon after, word reached the Spanish court of another empire, farther south, high in the Andes Mountains. A kingdom rich with gold and silver, the Inca Empire. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro, inspired by Cortés's success, led fewer than 200 men into the heart of the Inca realm. The Incas were recovering from civil war when he arrived, their vast empire weakened. Pizarro captured the Inca ruler, Atahualpa, in a daring ambush at Cajamarca. Though Atahualpa offered a ransom of gold and silver, enough to fill a room, it wasn't enough to save him. Pizarro had him executed. By 1533, Cuzco, the Incan capital, had fallen. The wealth that poured from the Andes stunned Europe. Silver from Potosí in present-day Bolivia and gold from Peru flooded Spanish treasuries. The riches funded cathedrals, wars, and the glory of Madrid, but they also fueled inflation and greed. The Spanish Empire grew vast, yet fragile. To govern these lands, Spain created a vast colonial system. The Americas were divided into viceroyalties, New Spain in the north, centered in Mexico City, and Peru in the south, governed from Lima. These were not mere provinces, they were miniature kingdoms, ruled in the king's name by viceroys with near absolute authority. The church became Spain's most powerful institution overseas. Missionaries, Franciscans, Dominicans, Jesuits, spread Christianity across the continents. They founded missions, built schools, and baptized millions. Yet conversion was often forced. Indigenous spiritual traditions were branded as pagan or demonic. Ancient temples were destroyed. Statues of saints replaced the gods of the Old World. Still, beneath the surface, old beliefs endured. In remote villages, native peoples merged Catholic rituals with ancestral traditions. The Virgin Mary fused with mother goddesses of the earth. The cross stood beside sacred mountains and rivers. Out of conquest, a new, hybrid culture began to take shape, one that was neither fully Spanish nor fully indigenous. But while missionaries prayed, conquistadors continued to plunder. Expeditions pushed north into Florida, Texas, and the deserts of the Southwest. Hernando de Soto roamed the Mississippi Valley, Coronado searched for the 7 cities of gold. They found no golden kingdoms, only vast lands and resilient peoples who resisted fiercely. Spanish colonization was not a single story of conquest, it was a mosaic of victories, failures, alliances, and betrayals. Every region told a different tale. Some tribes welcomed the newcomers, hoping for allies against rival nations. Others fought to the death. Behind the shining facade of empire lay unimaginable suffering. The encomienda system, a brutal labor regime, granted Spanish settlers control over indigenous communities. In theory, it was meant to protect and Christianize them. In reality, it was slavery in all but name. Entire populations were worked to death in mines and plantations. Priests like Bartolomé de las Casas became horrified witnesses. Once a colonist himself, Las Casas turned into one of the fiercest defenders of native rights. His writings exposed the cruelty of the conquest, describing massacres and forced labor in haunting detail. He pleaded to the Spanish crown to end the abuses, and in 1542, his efforts led to the New Laws, a rare early attempt to limit colonial exploitation. But greed proved stronger than law. By the mid-16th century, Spain's empire stretched from California to Chile, from the Caribbean to the Philippines. It was the first global empire in history, connected by oceans and powered by silver. Galleons sailed from the New World to Seville and from Mexico across the Pacific to Manila. Spain's flag flew on nearly every horizon. Yet the empire's foundations rested on contradiction, immense wealth built on human misery. Indigenous populations fell by the millions, devastated by disease, war, and forced labor. African slaves were soon brought across the Atlantic to replace the dying native workforce. The Columbian Exchange, the vast transfer of plants, animals, and people, changed the world forever. Corn, potatoes, and tomatoes flowed to Europe. Horses, cattle, and wheat came to America. But so did smallpox, measles, and slavery. The New World was no longer new, it was becoming the center of a transformed global order. And through it all, Spain stood as the mightiest power on earth. Kings and queens ruled from palaces filled with the silver of the Andes and the blood of the Americas. But already, cracks were beginning to show. The seeds of resistance, rebellion, and change were being sown among the conquered peoples. The first century of colonization had ended. The age of conquest was giving way to the age of empire, and soon, to the age of revolution. Spanish Colonies in the New World, Part 2, The Empire of Faith and Gold. By the middle of the 16th century, Spain ruled a world beyond imagination. From Mexico City to Lima, from Havana to Manila, the empire glittered with the spoils of conquest. But power had to be organized, controlled, and justified, not only by the sword, but by the Spirit. Spain's kings claimed their authority came directly from God. In the New World, that divine mission took physical form, towering cathedrals of stone, plazas lined with government palaces, monasteries humming with prayer. The Catholic Church was not just a presence in colonial life, it was colonial life. Missionaries had followed the conquistadors into battle, carrying crosses beside swords. Now they became the moral architects of empire. Franciscan friars walked barefoot through mountain villages, preaching to the survivors of the conquest. Dominicans debated the ethics of colonization in university halls. Jesuits, the intellectual soldiers of faith, built schools and missions that stretched from Mexico to Paraguay. Every town, no matter how small, had its church at the center. Bells marked the hours of the day. Festivals honored the saints. Baptism, confession, marriage, and burial all passed through the hands of the church. To live under Spain was to live under God, or at least, under the church's interpretation of him. But conversion was rarely peaceful. Priests burned idols and banned native rituals. Indigenous leaders were forced to kneel before altars they barely understood. And yet, faith proved resilient. The conquered peoples did not simply abandon their gods, they transformed them. Across the Americas, ancient beliefs merged with Catholic symbols. The Virgin of Guadalupe, who, according to legend, appeared to a Nahua peasant in 1531, became a sacred bridge between worlds, a brown-skinned mother, both Spanish and indigenous, both Mary and Tenantzin. Her image spread across Mexico like wildfire, embodying a new spiritual identity. As the Church wove the empire's spiritual fabric, Spanish administrators built its social structure. Colonial society was a pyramid, rigid, racial, and precise. At the top stood the peninsulars, Spaniards born in Europe, loyal to the crown and the church. Beneath them were the criollos, people of Spanish blood born in the Americas. Though wealthy and educated, criollos were often barred from the highest offices, sowing the first seeds of resentment that would one day erupt into revolution. Below them were the mestizos, children of Spanish fathers and indigenous mothers. They were the living symbol of a new world, neither conqueror nor conquered, but both. Mestizos worked as artisans, soldiers, and small traders. Many adopted Spanish culture and language, yet carried in their faces and families the memory of native ancestors. Farther down were the indios, indigenous peoples bound to their villages and to the labor demands of the colonial system. And at the very bottom, Africanos esclavizados, enslaved Africans, torn from their homelands to toil in mines, plantations, and households across the New World. This racial order, known as the casta system, became a cornerstone of colonial life. Spanish painters even created elaborate portraits, casta paintings, depicting every possible mixture of race and blood, each labeled with names like mestizo, mulatto, zambo. It was bureaucracy turned into art, and prejudice turned into policy. As native populations declined under the weight of disease and exploitation, colonial economies faced a crisis: who would labor in the fields, who would mine the silver? The answer arrived in chains. By the 1520s, Spanish ships began carrying enslaved Africans to the Caribbean and the mainland. The transatlantic slave trade would soon become the beating heart of the empire's wealth. Men and women from West and Central Africa were sold in markets from Havana to Veracruz, from Cartagena to Lima. In the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, the air smelled of sweat and smoke. In the silver mines of Potosi, enslaved miners descended into darkness, breathing dust that burned their lungs. Some labored as domestic servants or craftsmen, carving a fragile dignity from despair. Yet even in bondage, culture endured. African rhythms, dances, and faith survived behind closed doors and in the spaces between Spanish rule. Drums echoed during secret gatherings. Saints in the church took on the faces of African gods. Over time, these hidden traditions mixed with native and European ones, creating new forms of music, cuisine, and spirituality that still define Latin America today. Colonial cities became microcosms of Spain, and yet, entirely new worlds. Mexico City rose on the ruins of Tenochtitlan, its streets laid out in Spanish grids but alive with Aztec foundations. Lima, the city of kings, became the jewel of South America, its balconies overlooking processions of bishops and beggars alike. Merchants from Seville and Cadiz filled the markets with European goods, silk, wine, and iron tools. In return, the colonies shipped back gold, silver, sugar, cacao, and precious dyes. A galleon could carry millions of pesos in treasure across the ocean, or to its doom, if intercepted by English or Dutch pirates lurking in the Caribbean. Each voyage was a gamble. Hurricanes, mutinies, and corsairs turned the Atlantic into a graveyard of empire. Yet the flow of wealth continued, enriching Spain and draining its colonies. The people who made that wealth possible, miners, farmers, slaves, and indigenous laborers, rarely saw its rewards. But in the markets and streets of these colonial cities, new cultures were being born, a world of Spanish ballads sung with native drums, of European fashion stitched from American cotton, of prayers whispered in 3 languages. While cities grew into centers of trade and administration, missionaries pushed to the edges of the known world. Nowhere were they more influential than the Jesuits. In the dense jungles of Paraguay and Brazil, Jesuit priests built missions, small, self-sufficient towns where indigenous Guarani people were converted, educated, and trained in crafts and music. To the Jesuits, it was a utopian Christian experiment; to colonial officials, it looked dangerously independent. For over a century, these reductions, as they were called, flourished. They produced art, architecture, and orchestral music that blended European and native styles. But when Spain and Portugal redrew their borders in the 18th century, the missions were caught in the crossfire. The Jesuits were expelled, their utopian dream dissolved into dust. Despite oppression, resistance burned quietly in the hearts of the conquered. Indigenous rebellions flared throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, some crushed within days, others lasting years. The Mixton War in Mexico, the Tupac Amaru uprisings in the Andes, each was a cry against forced labor, tribute, and the destruction of native life. Slaves, too, rebelled. In the Caribbean and along the coasts of Central America, runaway Africans formed palenques and quilombos, independent communities hidden deep in forests and mountains. They traded, farmed, and fought back when Spanish soldiers came to reclaim them. Even within cities, quiet defiance thrived. Native artisans painted their gods in the corners of church murals. African rhythms slipped into church music. Spanish words were reshaped by indigenous tongues. The empire might have conquered the land, but it could never fully conquer the soul. By the 1600s, the Americas had become a living fusion of worlds. Spanish, African, and indigenous influences intertwined in every aspect of daily life. The result was a new civilization, unequal and often brutal, but profoundly creative. In kitchens, maize met olive oil, chocolate was mixed with sugar from the Caribbean. On the streets, the Spanish guitar met the African drum and gave birth to new sounds, precursors to the rhythms that would later travel the globe. Religious festivals became spectacles of color and music, half Catholic, half ancestral. Markets overflowed with textiles, pottery, and silverwork that carried patterns from 3 continents. And amid this blend, new identities emerged: Criollos proud of their land, mestizos proud of their dual heritage, Africans and natives who reimagined freedom through faith and family. The empire that had begun as conquest was transforming into something the kings of Spain could never have foreseen, a continent of mixed peoples with a shared, complex destiny. Yet behind this cultural brilliance, injustice deepened. The wealth of the Americas flowed endlessly to Europe. Spanish nobles built palaces, colonial elites hosted grand fiestas. Meanwhile, peasants starved, and slaves died by the thousands. As the 17th century advanced, Spain's empire began to show cracks. Wars in Europe drained its treasury. Pirates and rival nations gnawed at its colonies. And within, a restless generation of criollos started asking a dangerous question: why should we obey a king across the ocean? The empire that once seemed eternal was beginning to rot from within. The faith that united it also divided it. The riches that sustained it also weakened it. The new world was no longer new, it was restless, alive, and ready for change. Spanish Colonies in the New World, Part 3, The Fall of Empire. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Spanish Empire stretched farther than any realm in human history. Its banners flew over half the Americas, across the Caribbean, the Pacific, and even the distant Philippines. But behind the illusion of grandeur, decay had already begun. Spain's golden age had turned to shadow. The endless wars of Europe, the corruption of courtly politics, and the drain of colonial wealth had left the empire hollow. The treasure fleets still crossed the Atlantic, but much of their silver ended up in the pockets of bankers in London and Amsterdam. And in the New World, a new generation was rising, born under Spanish rule, but no longer content to live forever in its shadow. Across Europe, a revolution of the mind was spreading, the Enlightenment. Philosophers spoke of reason, equality, and the rights of man. Books by Locke, Voltaire, and Rousseau found their way across the ocean, hidden in the trunks of scholars, priests, and merchants. In Mexico, Peru, and New Granada, Criollo intellectuals debated these new ideas in secret salons. They admired Spain's culture but questioned its authority. Why should a man born in Lima be inferior to one born in Madrid? Why should wealth created in the Americas serve only European masters? At the same time, the Bourbon kings who replaced the Habsburg dynasty in Spain sought to reform their empire. The so-called Bourbon reforms of the 1700s were meant to modernize colonial administration, to tighten control, increase taxes, and centralize power. But instead of renewal, they ignited resentment. Local elites lost privileges, native communities faced heavier tribute, and trade restrictions strangled colonial economies. The crown demanded more, yet offered little in return. Everywhere, frustration simmered beneath the surface. The empire was still immense, but it was no longer united. The first great flame of resistance came from the Andes. In 1780, a Quechua nobleman named José Gabriel Condorcanqui, known by his ancestral title, Tupac Amaru II, rose against Spanish oppression. Calling for the end of forced labor and the abuses of the corregidors, colonial officials, he led tens of thousands of indigenous and mestizo followers through the highlands of Peru. His revolt spread like wildfire, uniting villages, terrifying colonial authorities. For a moment, it seemed the Andes themselves were shaking off their chains. But Spain's vengeance was merciless. Tupac Amaru II was captured, forced to watch the execution of his family, then torn apart by horses in the plaza of Cuzco. His death, meant to crush rebellion, instead made him a legend, a symbol of freedom that would echo through the next century. Other uprisings followed. In New Granada, in Quito, in Venezuela, protests against taxes, trade monopolies, and corruption. Most were crushed, yet each left a scar, a memory of defiance. Then, in 1808, came the earthquake that shattered everything. Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain. The French army forced King Ferdinand VII to abdicate, placing Napoleon's brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. Across the Atlantic, confusion reigned. Who was the legitimate ruler now? In Mexico City, Caracas, Buenos Aires, and Bogotá, local juntas, councils claiming loyalty to the true king, took power to govern in his name. But once they tasted authority, they would never give it back. What began as loyalty soon turned to independence. At the same time, half a world away, the United States had already blazed a trail. Its revolution proved that colonies could break free from an empire. Its success inspired men and women across Latin America, criollos, mestizos, and even slaves, to dream of the same. In 1810, Miguel Hidalgo, a parish priest in the small town of Dolores, Mexico, rang his church bell and called his people to rise. His cry, "Viva la Virgen de Guadalupe, muera el mal gobierno," became known as El Grito de Dolores, the Cry of Dolores. Peasants, farmers, and townspeople joined him, marching under the banner of the Virgin. They were armed with farm tools and faith. For a time, they swept through central Mexico, challenging the colonial regime. But Hidalgo was captured and executed. His head was placed in an iron cage and hung from a city wall, yet his dream could not be silenced. Others took up his cause. José María Morelos, a mestizo priest who organized the first Mexican Congress, Vicente Guerrero, a mixed-race general who refused to surrender. Decades of war followed, tearing the land apart, but by 1821, Mexico was free. To the south, in the vast plains and mountains of South America, two names rose like thunder: Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín. Bolívar, El Libertador, fought from Venezuela through Colombia, Ecuador, and Bolivia, dreaming of a united continent. San Martín, crossing the Andes with an army forged in Argentina, liberated Chile and Peru. Their campaigns were epic, battles fought across jungles, deserts, and snow-capped peaks. Spain's armies, once invincible, now bled out in distant lands. By 1825, almost all of Latin America had declared independence. The Spanish Empire in the Americas was gone. Spain's fall was both sudden and inevitable. After 3 centuries of domination, the New World slipped from its grasp like sand through fingers. In Madrid, kings and nobles mourned the loss, not just of lands, but of purpose. The empire that once claimed to be the defender of faith and civilization now faced poverty and political chaos at home. But across the Americas, the legacy of Spain endured, complex, contradictory, and inescapable. The Spanish language became the heartbeat of entire continents. Catholicism remained the dominant faith, yet reimagined through local traditions. Spanish law, architecture, and art left their mark on every city square, every cathedral dome. And beneath that surface, the indigenous and African roots of the New World continued to pulse, reshaping culture, music, and identity in ways that Spain could never have imagined. The nations that emerged from the ruins of empire faced enormous challenges. Independence did not bring peace or equality. Class divisions, racial hierarchies, and foreign debts persisted. New republics struggled between democracy and dictatorship, unity and fragmentation. Yet through all the turmoil, a shared spirit endured, the conviction that this land, once conquered, now belonged to its people. In Mexico, the Virgin of Guadalupe remained the symbol of national identity. In the Andes, the memory of Tupac Amaru II inspired new generations. In every former colony, people rewrote their history, no longer as subjects of a king, but as citizens of a continent reborn. The Spanish Empire had sought to bring faith, wealth, and order to the New World. What it left instead was a mosaic of nations, bound by history, divided by struggle, yet united by culture, language, and endurance. Today, from California to Patagonia, the echoes of that empire still whisper in every church bell, every marketplace, every festival. The ghosts of conquistadors, priests, rebels, and slaves all share the same soil. It is a legacy of suffering and survival, of destruction and creation. A reminder that the story of the Spanish colonies was not just about conquest. It was about transformation. The New World was born in fire, but out of that fire came a new humanity, forged from 3 continents, countless cultures, and unbroken hope. This is the legacy of Spain in the Americas, not an empire of gold, but an empire of memory, still alive in every heartbeat of the New World. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads.